Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. When we look back on this summer sometime in the future, it's possible that it'll be seen as the one where the world really woke up to the reality of climate change. The urgency of the latest report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the deadly heat waves on the West Coast that cause wildfires that burned the town of Lytton, BC to the ground, the flash floods in China and in Europe. Climate change is here, and it's happening right under our noses. But a lot of experts would tell you that this reality hasn't really been reflected in this federal election campaign. Many other issues have gotten way more attention, and trying to navigate all the different promises if you're not a climate expert is kind of a nightmare. Climate change did get a bit of attention at the English language debate last week, but if you were confused trying to figure out where all the different parties stand and how their platforms compare, you're probably not the only one. Luckily, my guest today has spent hours poring over all the major parties' promises and experts' analyses of them, and she's going to bring us up to speed.
I think you need to look at it in two ways. One is ambition, which is good and kind of gives you a signal of what the parties theoretically want to do. The other is feasibility.
That's Emma Gilchrist. She's the editor-in-chief, co-founder, and executive director of The Narwhal, a nonprofit journalism organization investigating environmental issues, and we're going to talk about how all the platforms stack up, which plans are the most ambitious, and which are the most realistic. You're listening to The Decibel. Emma, hi. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's just dive right into it. Before we get to talking about individual platforms, I wonder if we can start by having you tell me what targets do experts say we need to hit in order not to let temperatures go beyond the 2 degrees over pre-industrial levels?
Yeah, so experts say that for Canada to contribute its fair share to ensure that we don't go above the 1.5 degree level, we need to be in the 40 to 45% range of emissions reductions by 2030. And to stay within 2 degrees, it's about the 30% reduction by 2030. And scientists are already being a little bit blown away by how severe the impacts are already. And so even if we reduce our emissions immediately, those impacts are going to increase over the next few decades. So that's really why scientists say, 1.5 is really about the limit of what we want to do to not cause mass chaos.
Okay, so that's the goal. And let's start by giving listeners the broad strokes of each of the parties' climate plan. So why don't we start with the Liberals? Can you take me through what they have planned? Maybe talk about their emissions targets, their plan for carbon pricing, and then their support for the oil and gas industry. Let's treat those as the main pillars of these platforms.
Yeah, so the Liberals have committed to keep Canada's emissions reduction target at 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. And they have, within that, committed to continuing with the carbon tax, which will increase to $170 a ton by 2030. So those are really the key pillars there. One really important new thing in their platform is that they've implemented targets for the oil and gas sector so that one of Canada's largest sources of emissions, currently responsible for 26% of our country's emissions, is also going to have to figure out how to reduce its emissions. Mm-hmm. So the Liberals commit to establishing a $2 billion diversification fund for oil and gas producing provinces. So I quite like that combination of things because it shows they're both actually serious about reducing emissions in the oil and gas sector while recognizing that that's going to be hard and that we're going to need to commit funding to making that possible and making that fair.
Okay, so what are the main differences between their plan and that of the Conservatives?
Yeah, so the Conservatives are proposing to roll back Canada's climate targets to 30% reduction by 2030, and they would only increase the industrial carbon price to $170 a ton if our trading partners do the same. So it's really contingent on others doing that. There's a number of differences, like they propose a low carbon savings account through which consumers would basically, instead of having revenue from a carbon tax go into government coffers, which is then either given back to taxpayers through other means and used to make systemic changes, like building public transit, for instance. They would have it go back on kind of a debit card for Canadians to theoretically go and use to buy green, home upgrades and other green purchases.
So that's like if I'm buying a tank of gas or something, the tax that I pay on that would not go to the government. It would go on this debit card thing that I could then use to make other green purchases.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, which sounds like a little bit of a bureaucratic nightmare to have this new debit card system for every Canadian. And it also kind of goes against the whole psychology of a carbon tax, which is to, disincentivize people from buying high carbon things by making them pay more for it. If you then give that money literally directly back to them to spend on something else, it doesn't necessarily achieve that end of discouraging the use of, say, a gas guzzling vehicle.
Right. And what does their platform say for how they're going to handle the oil and gas industry moving forward? What kind of support are they going to give to that industry?
There's a lot of support for continued development in the fossil fuel sector from the Conservative platform. They do offer some money for worker training for worker transition, which is good. But they also, for instance, talk about reversing Bill C-69, which modernized how Canada reviews major resource projects. That was legislation that was already massively watered down after intense lobbying by the fossil fuel industry. So, yeah, they basically would take Canada's environmental assessment process backwards, which is pretty concerning. They would make oil export pipelines a priority in general, and they also want to implement a federal liquefied natural gas export strategy. Liquefied natural gas rely on the quite controversial process of fracking in BC and Alberta and are really emissions intensive.
And how do the Conservatives justify continuing with oil and gas development, considering the realities of climate change? How do they explain their position?
So the Conservatives, basically point to how the oil and gas sector is super important for the economy, particularly in Alberta. And they also have these, kind of little tells in their platform where, for instance, they say, Canada is only responsible for 2% of global emissions. Of course, Canada is also one of the highest per capita, producer of emissions in the world. But I think they point often to how other jurisdictions are doing worse. And so if somebody's going to provide oil and gas, it might as well be us.
Let's move on to the NDP. They have a very ambitious climate plan. Can you break it down for me?
They have committed to lowering Canada's emissions by 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. And that is actually in line with the U.S. commitment. So U.S. President Biden has committed to a 50% reduction as well. The challenge with the NDP platform is that all of the experts who have tried to assess whether the policies are there to actually achieve that target have basically said that there just isn't enough detail there to assess, the tangibility of meeting it.
Yeah. So what did they say about carbon pricing? I know that they say that they do support it, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of detail on that front.
Yeah, the NDP basically support a very similar plan to the Liberals in terms of carbon pricing, so ratcheting up to $170 a ton by 2030. So they definitely have more of a focus on the worker transition. The NDP talk about creating 1 million new good jobs in all regions, focusing on building green infrastructure, for instance, providing expanded employment insurance benefits and retraining and job placement services. They also talk about supporting investments in community-owned and operated clean energy projects to work in partnership with Indigenous and Northern communities to move off diesel. They want to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and redirect these funds to low-carbon initiatives while putting in place legislation to prevent future governments from reversing those decisions.
Okay. And then last but not least, the Greens. This has always been their wheelhouse. How do they think Canada should go about fighting climate change?
Yeah, so they have the highest target of them all, not surprisingly. They propose a 60% emissions reduction target by 2030. But again, the detail isn't really there in the plan to be able to say if they could meet that target with the policies that they have proposed. They do speak more specifically to how they would treat the oil and gas sector. They say that they would phase out oil and gas operations between 2030 and 2035, especially bitumen production, so that's the oil sands. They would cancel all pipeline projects, and they would ban fracking, the controversial way of accessing natural gas for liquefied natural gas projects. They also talk about implementing a Just Transition Act and making sure that fossil fuel sector jobs can be replaced with green sector jobs.
Yeah, and just really quickly, what is just transition for people who don't know? I feel like I've been hearing this term a lot.
Yeah, it's kind of some language that Canada has picked up from the U.S. I personally prefer the phrase responsible transition because there's actually opinion polling that shows that just transition doesn't really sit very well with the workers for whom the transition is supposedly for. But the concept really is that to responsibly transition to new forms of energy, we need to take care of the workers who currently rely upon the oil and gas sector, and not just the workers, but the communities. There's entire communities that would basically cease to exist without the oil and gas industry right now. So it's about really being mindful and putting resources into ensuring that those communities have a future.
So as you've outlined, some of the parties have way more ambitious emissions targets than others. The Greens are saying 60%. The NDP is saying 50%. Targets are very different from the costs and policies that it would take to get us to reach those targets, right? And I wonder what you think voters should pay attention to when they're looking at these platforms.
Yeah, I think you need to look at it in two ways. One is ambition, which is good and kind of gives you a signal of what the parties theoretically want to do. The other is feasibility. And many experts have kind of ranked the feasibility of the platforms, and the Liberals, for its detail, ranks the highest on feasibility. So in that sense, you have that. That said, we're very likely to end up in a minority government situation. And, from a climate perspective, it wouldn't be a bad scenario to have the Liberals having to cooperate with a party that has higher climate ambition and helps hold their feet to the fire in terms of climate targets.
And let's talk a little bit more about what experts think of these plans. What do they say about the credibility of the Liberals' plans, considering their track record over the last 6 years, the fact that they bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline, for example?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag on that. Emissions have continued to increase in Canada, while emissions in, most of the other G7 countries have decreased. So they certainly haven't had a perfect track record on this. At the same time, they've managed to implement federal carbon pricing, which is a really heavy lift. They really outline in a very detailed fashion policies that can get Canada to that 40% emissions reduction target that they promise. So while certainly not perfect, and I don't think they're ever going to shed the baggage of buying the Trans Mountain Pipeline, most climate policy experts do say that their plan is feasible.
But the Conservatives' climate plan's gotten a lot of attention because it includes a price on carbon, and they seem to have dropped this fight against the carbon tax that's taken up a lot of space over the last few years. And is their plan viable, and is it ambitious enough? What do experts say about that?
Where the Conservatives do well is in the viability, but where it falls down is on ambition, in that it actually reduces our emissions target. It changes what we've committed to under the Paris Climate Agreement. And so that is thought by many to be an embarrassment on the international stage, and certainly not the direction that most experts would say that we need to be moving in after a summer of heat waves and forest fires and literally hundreds of deaths due to those things.
Okay, so on the NDP, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau pointed out a few times during the English language debate that the NDP's climate platform did really poorly in a recent report from Policy Options. He kept saying that experts have given it an F. Can you tell me why that is, and what are the main criticisms of the NDP's climate plans?
Yeah, really the main criticism is just that it's vague. Like, when you read the NDP platform, you feel like you're reading the preamble to the platform and then you're waiting for the bullet points to come and then they never come. So it's just not specific enough to really assess. The ambition is there, the general principle is there, but they don't put the meat on the bones. That said, the NDP is not in the running to govern this country. So they don't have the same amount of pressure as the Liberals and the Conservatives rightly do to have to cost their plans and be very specific about what it would look like.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't see too much in the way of promises for individual voters, aside from like that savings account that you mentioned that the Conservatives are promising, in terms of tax rebates and things like that. Is there anything we should highlight that's there for people, like individual voters?
Yeah, there's not really a lot of goodies like that in this year's platforms. But one thing that there is rebates on electric vehicles in the Liberal platform. That appears not to be there in the Conservative platform. So that's up to $5,000 in the Liberal platform. In the NDP platform, I believe it's up to $15,000 rebates on electric vehicles. With accepting that carbon pricing is the most efficient way to make these changes, really that's creating those pricing signals right across the economy in everything, and then enabling government to invest in the systemic solutions, which actually help people, say, get out of private cars. And while there can be a lot of focus on things like electric vehicle rebates, because they're kind of fun to talk about, the reality is from like an equity point of view, we need to make it more possible for people to get around without a private vehicle. And also from an environmental perspective, that's much more environmentally friendly as well. So that's where the carbon tax really enables some of those larger systemic shifts that give people the ability to make better choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at that. You've written about another element of the platforms, which gets overlooked a lot of the time in these conversations, and that's nature-based solutions and plans to protect Canada's vast wild spaces. And tell me why that's important, and tell me how the parties plan to do that.
Yeah, so nature-based solutions it's really exciting to see them talked about in this election because they haven't really been talked about before. And basically, that's looking at the role of keeping landscapes like forests and wetlands and peatlands, farmlands and grasslands intact and also restoring them. And those ecosystems, they store tremendous amounts of carbon. And Canada is home to vast amounts of those types of landscape. And so by protecting those places and restoring those types of landscapes, we can actually get 11% of the way to our emissions targets for 2030 just through doing those things. So they have a really big role to play. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting to see the Liberals and the Conservatives speak to nature-based climate solutions in their platforms. The Liberals committed to creating 10 new national parks and 10 new national marine conserved areas in the next 5 years. They also promised to create 15 new urban national parks by 2030, which is really, I think, top of mind for people during COVID. So many people have been out using their, green spaces in urban centers. The Liberals have also promised to create a $50 million BC Old Growth Nature Fund. That's something that would help to end conflicts like the Fairy Creek blockades, which have been going on for over a year now in British Columbia. Mm-hmm. The Liberals also promised to support more Indigenous protected areas and Indigenous guardians programs, and they commit to restoring and enhancing more wetlands, grasslands, and peatlands to capture and store carbons. And then in the Conservative platform, what we're seeing is they have a bit of a lower target in terms of how much they want to protect, but they do talk about the importance of Indigenous protected areas and Indigenous guardians programs, which are an important part of nature-based climate solutions and protection in general. They have the most specific commitment on nature-based climate solutions. They commit to investing an additional $3 billion between now and 2030, focused on management of forests, crop and grazing lands, and restoration of grasslands, wetlands.
And I guess finally, I just want to ask for your honest assessment. When you compare and contrast these platforms, Whose plans do you think are the most realistic and most effective at getting us to our climate goals?
It's such a tough question because the different parties are stronger on different things. But at the end of the day, the conservative climate target moves us backwards. The Liberals have a fairly ambitious and feasible plan. And the NDP and the Greens have very ambitious but less detailed plans, but could help to hold the Liberal government's feet to the fire should they be at play in a minority government.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, considering, the summer that we've had with hundreds of people dying in the heat waves on the West Coast and the IPCC report, which basically said that, this is code red for humanity. Do you think that climate change has gotten enough attention in this campaign?
Not really. It has consistently polled as one of the top things that people are talking about, but it's not what's being talked about in the news a lot, I think. And that's for lots of good reasons in terms of, the crisis in Afghanistan, was really top of the news for the first couple of weeks of the election. Mm-hmm. And then, now the protesters and hecklers at Trudeau rallies are getting, a ton of the coverage. And so I don't know, it's been a weird election. And then, of course, COVID, the pandemic has been really, really top of mind as well. So I don't think it has got enough attention yet. Most of the polling shows that it's still top of mind for voters. So we know that it'll be on their minds when they go to the ballot box.
Okay, Emma, thank you so much for helping us make sense of all this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Emma Gilchrist. You can find more of her work at thenarwhal.ca. That's thenarwhal.ca. And you'll find stories from The Narwhal and The Globe if you sign up for the Globe's climate newsletter at globeandmail.com/newsletters. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at anima_TK. If you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.